you. So a couple of things before we get started. We'll be having a panel where Chenjerai, Kumanyika, and I are going to pose questions, and then after that, it's going to be followed by a relatively long Q&A. So when you want to ask a question after the panel, put it in the stack. You can write stack in the chat, and then we'll do our best to actually spotlight you so that you can ask your question to all of us. So welcome. So tonight, we're taking a little different tack than we do in Freedom School, and we're focusing on a very specific issue that centers at Rutgers, but is also relevant for many different universities, including the University of Vermont, which we're going to spend some time talking about today. So we're focused on the issue of budget, and I have to say I'm really excited about that because, you know, the things that are really important to us are the things that affect our everyday lives. And I think that for almost everyone on this call, the budget has become central to every different facet of our working life, our research, our teaching, our colleagues, all of the 30,000 workers that make Rutgers run, our 20,000 graduate students. All of us right now are being affected in really profound ways by the budget. So tonight is really a forum for political education to talk about RCM, responsibility-centered management, and what its consequences are, which I think the various successive budget systems that we've had, all of them have had different problems, but we really just are reaching a critical point where we don't have the money that we need for the most basic functions of the university, research and teaching. And I'm going to give a kind of overview about this, and our wonderful speakers will be talking about the particularities of RCM and how it affects each of them and the class of workers that they belong to. But, you know, one of the biggest concerns I have is about not having sufficient funds for our graduate students. Rutgers can everyone mute? We seem to be getting a little bit of feedback. Rutgers is an R1 university. It is a wonderful, wonderful public university with a long and storied history. But we have seen a consistent defunding of the graduate programs. And during the pandemic, it has literally reached a crisis proportion. So a big part of the budget discussion is also thinking about how the monies are being allocated, what they're being spent on, and what we think they should be spent on. And I think one of the most urgent things right now is finding the money for a graduate extension. We have graduate students now who for almost a year, and by the end of the semester it will be in a year and a half, have not been able to do their field work, their research, their work in labs, and really have been denied the opportunities of the kind of materials they need in order to write their dissertations. So I do want to flag that, and we'll be talking about that in a number of different ways. But when I think of the current budget crisis, to me, I personally, in witnessing its effect on faculty and graduate students, this one really stands out in my mind. The second one is the cut to the libraries. So we're in a pandemic in which we have been, out of necessity, have been teaching remotely. And right now is the time where we need real digital supports and funding for our library. And yet we are facing a $1.7 million cut that is really catastrophic for our library, which already has been under-resourced for decades and decades. This discussion about the budget also comes out of our recent SAS faculty meeting and resolution, in which we want to establish a faculty committee that would have access to information about the budget and would oversee it. And so it's really in this context of talking about the budget as a way to link to questions of faculty and graduate student governance and of all of the workers that work at Rutgers. And I guess before passing the mic to my co-host, I just wanted to say a few words about Rutgers in relationship to the rest of the country. We have a very exciting initiative that has started at Rutgers from Jennifer Mittelstadt in the history department, and she's working with a whole group of scholars from across the country at public institutions, nearly all at public institutions, for the Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education. And we'll be having a Freedom School on Scholars for a New Deal on February 25th. So in many ways, this is the first part of a two-part discussion about thinking about the kinds of constraints and challenges we're facing now and what solutions and a different vision for higher education would look like. But in planning meetings for the Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education, we were talking to AFT organizers, and in kind of a group context, we were all talking about the challenges that we face in our university. And I was laying out that Rutgers has fired over 5% of its workforce. So Rutgers is one of the biggest employers in New Jersey. And allegedly in response to the pandemic, they fired over 5% of their workforce. And it was very interesting. One of these national organizers for the American Federations of Teachers said that Rutgers was one of the worst, not the worst, from the point of view of the AFT for its response to the pandemic. Now, I was incredibly surprised by this. We are in a deep blue state. And of course, AFT organizers are meeting, teachers and faculty and workers from all over the country. And I asked her why that was. And she said that the most shocking thing about Rutgers is that we had a restoration of $120 million of our state funding from New Jersey, thanks to the lobbying efforts of our coalition of Rutgers unions. So it's the scale of firing over 5% of your workforce while having disproportionately more resources available to them. So I want to stress that what's happening at Rutgers has already been noted by the largest teachers union in the United States, that it is one of the worst responses. She later wrote to me after Kansas University passed its resolution to be able to fire even tenured faculty after 30 days notice, to let me know that this was indeed worse. So I just want to keep that in the back of our mind. We're in a democratic state and, a kind of area that we think of ourselves as being incredibly well-resourced. But the brutality of the austerity campaign that has been imposed on Rutgers is really capturing the attention of national organizers. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Chenjerai Kumanyika, who is a researcher, journalist, and organizer who works as an assistant professor at Rutgers University Department of Journalism and Media Studies. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections of social justice and emerging media in the cultural and creative industries. And he is the creator of an amazing Peabody Award-winning podcast called Uncivil. Chenjerai.
Hey, everyone. Just really excited to be here. So excited that all of you came, and just really, always enthused to be a part of this union. Just to underscore a few things before we get started, there's two big points I would like to make before we get into people who really understand this. First of all, in an environment where we're talking about, racial and economic justice, where we're talking about the need for justice around gender, sexuality, disability, when we talk about budgets and the administrative philosophies that underlie them, these are things that are part of those struggles. It's really easy to see sort of racial politics around race when we're dealing with the sort of spectacles that we see with the police. But when we get into budgets, right, budgets are political documents. And that brings me to the second point, which is that some of the responses that I've seen and that you all will see when we present the kinds of concerns that Donna just laid out so clearly, and that we'll get even more discussion of today, the response is often, oh, you can't really understand it. People try to go into various minutiae related to the budget in an effort to sort of render it not political, right? This is just about the weeds and it's too complicated for you to understand. And so I think that we're here to sort of reject that view and to empower everyone with the knowledge so that we can respond to that and be clear about the political priorities. So having said that, as a person who's not an expert on RCM, I did work with our union to try to make a brief video that explained it. So we'd like to just play that briefly, and then we'll really get in with the people who really understand this on a deeper level. So could we play that video?
Hi, I'm Chenjerai Kumanyika, and I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Information and a proud member of Rutgers AAUP. Rutgers' stated mission is to teach, research, and serve, and that's what we're dedicated to as a union. But the administration that manages Rutgers has different priorities. They don't think about running Rutgers as a public university. They run Rutgers as a business under a budgeting system called RCM. What is RCM and why does it matter? RCM means Responsibility-Centered Management, but what those letters really stand for is a system that pits departments, research centers, and programs against each other. RCM requires your department or center to balance its budget based on how much money you make for Rutgers, not what's best for our academic mission. After the administration skims off a big percentage of the money we bring in for their expenses, we have to make do with what's left, and that forces faculty into choices we shouldn't have to make, like cutting teaching, reducing graduate positions, laying off staff, increasing class sizes, or eliminating entire programs. Student learning and university research suffers. And you know who doesn't have to balance their budget based on the money they make for Rutgers? The administration. Of the $4.5 billion Rutgers brings in annually, 1 in every $7 that comes in from our students' tuition and our research grants and elsewhere is siphoned off to the administration to fund bloated salaries and mysterious vanity projects. And they never have to justify to anybody how they spend that money. That's why there's more new top-level managers at Rutgers than any other job category, because management does like hiring more managers. The total amount spent on administration expenses jumped 20% in 2 years from 2017 to 2019. Meanwhile, because of the fiscal emergency, faculty salaries are frozen, research budgets cut, grad funding extensions denied, and more than 1,000 union workers, disproportionately workers of color, have been laid off and lost health insurance in the midst of a pandemic. In the end, RCM is a choice that management shouldn't make, a choice to prioritize administrators and donors over students and workers.
Great. Am I back on? Okay. Well, cool. Yeah. So, I mean, we're about to really get into that, but I just also, one quick thing I want to do also is I want to make sure I thank everybody who's helped to put this event together. All these union events we do is a lot of people who come together, and we got Alan behind the scenes who's really helping, and Jacob and others, and we want to have all that work recognized. So, but as we go more into this, right, I want to introduce David Hughes. And so he's going to be our first speaker. David Hughes is a former president of AAUP-AFT and currently serves as the treasurer and bargaining co-chair. And as his day job, he teaches anthropology in New Brunswick. So welcome, David.
All right, thanks a lot, Chenjerai. Thanks, Donna. I guess I'm coming through here.
Yeah. I'll just go ahead and give you this question if you don't mind. Could you give us an overview of what RCM is and what the consequences are for our university community? And could you also speak to like what concrete alternative might look like?
Okay, perfect. I'm glad I prepared for that. Thanks to Donna. So I want to start at a kind of a very high bird's eye view and ask the question. I'm going to be answering a bunch of questions which are really subparts, I think, of Chenjerai's large question. So the first question is why should the whole Rutgers budget, and not just our individual pieces of it, matter to us now? Right? Now, we're used to fighting over, if you have a little research account, you want to defend that. You may want to defend your department's budget or the budget for this course or that course, or even your school's budget. And that's the kind of thing that particularly faculty do very well. We fight over protecting our turf. And so I presume that you're here because you think beyond your own turf. And I'm going to give you further reasons to think that way and give you reasons that you can tell your colleagues who don't think that way. So the first thing is that fighting over our turf is exactly what RCM is about. That's exactly what the administration wants. They want to set units into competition with each other over resources. So, we're playing into their game if we try very hard exclusively to defend our own department. The other reason to fight over the budget is it's actually a text. right? The text that we get from the administration all the time, that is the talk, sounds good. You know, the strategic plan that Barchi came out with, that sounded nice. It talked about governance and excellence and things like that. You know, Holloway now is talking about the beloved community, like he invented the concept. Also sounds very nice. But the budget is the walk, right? The budget is where the rubber meets the road. And if you can interpret that, you tell a story that is more detailed and more truthful than statements like the beloved community and the strategic plan. So what the story the budget tells, of course, is about priorities. It's about what the administration wants to do and what the administration values. And it matters so much more than what they say. This is what they do. And we've been fighting over those values for a long time as faculty and grads and other staff and all the unionized workers at Rutgers have been fighting over these values, but we haven't been fighting over these values in connection with the budget writ large. So one of the purposes of this event is to connect the struggle that we have over values of our university with a struggle over money. And, oh, somebody might want to mute there. And a struggle over how money is conceptualized. So, second question, what is a budget? This actually is something that I only got my head around recently. We've been working with some very, very professional accountants. And I've realized that, well, first of all, budget, it comes from various Latin and French roots that have to do with a purse or a pocket. So it's meant to be small. A budget is a term that constrains things. It's meant to be a part of the whole, right? And it's limited in scope and time. As I say, it's part of the whole in scope. In time, it's a year, usually. So we talk about an annual budget. No institution lives for only a year. So a budget is an artificial snapshot in a way. And also, a budget is always prospective. It's always looking forward, right? And in a sense, a budget doesn't actually exist. It is a hope or a plan or a dream or a scheme. When the year is done, institutions no longer talk about budgets. They look at what happened. So that's like that. Often accountants use it to distinguish between the forecast and the actual, right? The forecast is forward-looking as a potential. The actual is backward-looking as history, as empirical, okay? So the lesson to take home from here is that the budget is kind of a quantitative rhetorical device designed to constrain and create scarcity, right? Think about it this way. Everybody knows this from their own personal lives. Let's say you're fortunate enough to earn $100,000 a year. And let's say you're putting 15 of that away into retirement. And so you tell yourself, you tell your family, well, I've got an $85,000 budget this year. That's not the money that you have. The money that you have is 100 every year. And in fact, this year, because you've been saving 15 every previous year, this year you may have 200 available as assets. But the budget is just a part of that, which has been artificially carved off from the whole into this device that we call, as I said, a budget. So let me tell you what the real resources are. I'm going to go into hold on, I can't talk and find it at the same time. Here we go. So I'm showing you slides, but I could just as easily be clicking through. So this, I hope you can see it right, is finance.rutgers.edu. This is where the financial documents that the administration chooses to share with us are available. And the one that matters is the financial statement. So you click on that and you get to this, and you click on the most recent one available for fiscal 2019. Fiscal 2020 would normally be available. It normally would have been available for 3 months now. They're late, which is suspicious in and of itself. So I'll show you the most recently available one. And you get to this, the financial report. So the financial report is legally, Rutgers as a state university is legally required to submit its finances every year to a major auditing firm, in this case, Rutgers goes to KPMG, and KPMG assesses the financial health of the university. They do not look at the budget. In fact, the word budget appears only once in this 84-page document, and it's kind of in an abstract way. They don't care about the budget. What they care about are the assets and liabilities, and those are tabulated in what's called a statement of net position. So if you go to page 9, you find this. This is the summarized statement of net position as of June 30th. And here are reserves. So we had about $2 million, almost $2 million in reserves. Quick thing, it's a 4.5, now $4.6 billion budget. And then there are buildings here and things worth these are in thousands, so worth $6.5 to $7 billion altogether. But there are a bunch of liabilities and things. There are various debts the administration has taken on. And we come down to this 1.9 billion in reserves. That's yours. That's like our savings account. That's like our retirement account. Although Rutgers never retires, because it's always taking on revenue. So this is like the nest egg for whenever, right? And the endowment, which is another nest egg, is not even covered in these documents. The endowment is another 1.3 billion. I'm running out of time here. So let me just tell you that this $583 million refers to what is available as unrestricted reserves. That means legally they can be spent on anything. And in the past, the administration has described this as an emergency fund for really serious issues that come up, you know, and you might think we're in that kind of a situation now. So let me leave that and get to the point about RCM. What RCM is the reason why the administration is not spending its unrestricted reserves and why instead it's firing people. So what happens in responsibility center management is that the central administration takes the money that comes from the state. That's about 800 million. If you've ever heard administrators describe this, they tend to call it a subsidy, which obscures its actual function. Its actual function is that the state legislature intends to cover the costs of some of the costs of educating people in New Jersey. They intend that money to be spent on teaching, which means it would be spent on the schools. But it doesn't go to the schools, it goes to central. And then schools get some of it sometimes as a subsidy. But that's only a measure of desperation. Under responsibility-centered management, as Chenjerai said, we are expected to sit on our own bottoms. We are expected to eat what we kill. We are expected to live off the tuition and grants, but mostly tuition that we generate from students. That's what it means to be a responsibility center. We are supposed to extract resources from the people of New Jersey and from our students, who tend to be people who can't afford a great deal. All right, and that's how a responsibility center lives. There are two big exceptions to that. The athletics department is classed as a responsibility center and brings in revenue, but they lose money hand over fist every year, and they always get a big chunk of change from central with no questions asked. So we have to beg to get the money that the legislature wants us to have for education, and we get some of it. The athletics department has demands and receives as much as they want from the central administration. The central administration itself, as Chenjerai said, is sucking money upwards through taxes from the schools. So we don't even get to keep all of our own tuition. We have to pay a big chunk of it over to central for the services that they provide. And you can quibble about how valuable those services are and whether those services actually do a service whatsoever. So the result of this is that there's downward pressure on wages as schools try to save money by paying fewer people less. There's upward pressure on tuition as schools try to raise money, often through covert forms of tuition, like course fees. We deplete the curriculum by sacrificing courses that don't raise enough money. And this has often been the case with PTL taught courses where people are just summarily laid off. We coordinate poorly because we're competing for students. So study abroad programs often compete with language departments and things like this. People don't want to share, units don't want to share students. And the surpluses go towards central. Hold on, I need to look at my paper thing because the, what do you call it? The translation is cutting off my thing. Okay, right. The central gets huge amounts of surpluses from the schools, which then become budget surpluses altogether. And so every year before the pandemic, we were running a budget surplus. Here's where the budget becomes relevant again. We were running budget surpluses of 40 to 60 million. Where do you think those budget surpluses were going? Unrestricted reserves. So unrestricted reserves also represent what they've squeezed out of us through RCM and now refuse to give back to us in terms of job security to the people who generated that money. And administrators, by the way, love scarcity. They love it. The most miserable thing in the world is to be an administrator in an atmosphere of abundance because you have no power. What administrators, especially these kinds of administrators in the corporate university, love to do is ration. So, final slide here. How might it look different? And this is just what I came up with. This doesn't represent the union's position.
David, you have 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. This is just what I came up with by thinking about possibilities. We could think differently about the finances of the university. And thinking beyond the budget, thinking about basic principles here, include all resources. We could think that maybe, the top employee of the university shouldn't earn 50 times what the lowest paid full-time employee of the university. That's the football coach at 2 million versus some of Christine's members at 40,000, right? We could think about lowering this ratio quite a bit. We could think about redistributing from departments that bring in a lot of tuition to departments that don't. Because a university, this is the key point, universities don't work well when units compete against each other because the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. So these are some top priorities, and these are some things that really don't matter, right? So what we want to do ultimately is come up with a people-centered budget. And I hope I've given you some tools to criticize the management-centered budget that we have and some ways of thinking way outside the box and changing this administration, changing this university to be more humane. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And can you unshare your screen?
Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Our next speaker will be Ian Gavigan. Ian Gavigan is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History and a member of the AAUP-AFT Executive Council, as well as a member of Rutgers Grads United. And so, Ian, I have a question for you, which is the nearly year-long pandemic shutdown has had really serious consequences for PhD students. Many of us were just in a graduate student town hall and got to hear about how it's affecting graduate students throughout the university and throughout our 3 campuses. Students are struggling to try to finish their PhD dissertations, which is incredibly difficult because they've been shut out of labs, out of archives, unable to do field research. So it's really having kind of a catastrophic effect for grads. Can you talk about how our university's current budgeting system is affecting grads and the campaign that graduate students and the union are involved in for graduate student funding extensions? And I'm especially interested to hear how your own department has wrestled with RCM. Ian?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I was just on mute. Thank you so much, Donna and Chenjerai, and to the whole Freedom School team for having me on. I want to start by starting my clock so I don't go over. There we go. And I want to start by emphasizing that, first of all, and before I get to Donna's concrete question, I wanted to just emphasize that graduate education is a core component of public higher education, not just for our contribution to the teaching force, but also to fulfilling the kind of multi-pronged mission of higher ed. We teach, we learn, we research, and we produce knowledge, and we serve our communities. Under RCM, though, grad students aren't treated as part of this social mission. Instead, we're treated as budget lines. In particular, we're considered costs, meaning to departments that are swamped already and forced to borrow money from central admin to keep the lights on, graduate students become budgetary burdens. And so, as Donna said in her opening, from grad students' perspective, we've been seeing the systemic defunding of our programs. And what that means for us has been smaller cohorts, shorter packages, more precarious labor situations. Before the pandemic, many grads were already working not as TAs or GAs and not as fellows, but as adjunct faculty, earning adjunct wages with no or limited healthcare. Many have been forced into non-union jobs that are paid pitiful wages and designed specifically to subvert the union. That's the baseline we're starting with. And COVID has made it even worse. COVID has exacerbated the underlying problems produced by RCM and the systemic defunding of public higher education. Graduate students, as Donna mentioned, in a host of fields, I'm a historian, we do archival research. Many lab-based fields, people who need in-person collaboration, interviews, field work, almost all fields in a survey that that graduate students did last semester of the university, more than 2/3 of all graduate students reported the need for at least a year of funding extension. And yet the university has refused to give us what we need to finish our programs. Meanwhile, at our elite peer institutions, graduate students in similar situations are actually seeing resources rushed to them. So graduate students in many of our peer institutions are going to not only be able to finish their dissertations, they're going to be able to finish them with all of the resources that they needed. And that, with the atrocious job market that we're all facing, does not bode well. But bringing it back to Rutgers, what this means for grad students is really layoffs in all but name. If you don't get the funding you need to finish your program, you don't finish. And if you don't have a pay, and you don't have a paycheck. But Rutgers doesn't have to call that a layoff. Now, in some departments, like in history and in several others, history at New Brunswick, faculty have been able to fight hard and negotiate compromises with RCM. They've been able to fight back and get something from it. By borrowing against future budgets, history has been able to ensure extensions for most current students. In exchange, though, we're also shrinking the number of grads we're admitting. So while that's a really important and powerful deal that we were able to make, and certainly an important way of finding a solution to the current crisis we're in, without structural change to RCM and a shifting of the cost burden off of undergrad student debt and onto the university and the state, all we're doing is cannibalizing programs and hurting our fields. So we're seeing a crisis in graduate education that poses an existential crisis to the future of higher education. Without grad students, what happens to research? What happens to our fields? What happens to teaching? Ending RCM and centralizing funding and upping public support are necessary first steps to guaranteeing that that higher education can thrive, to guaranteeing that graduate students get full packages that reflect the time and resources we need to complete our dissertations and to move forward. And to that end, graduate students organized through the Graduate Student Steering Committee in the union, as well as through Rutgers Grads United, which is an umbrella organization for all graduate students, whether they're represented by the union or not, are starting to launch a campaign to demand, whether it's through other kinds of pressure for PhD students, to ensure that that the delay that we've experienced can be made up for in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop and yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Ian. Really appreciate that. Our next speaker will be Angela Lawrence, and Angela is the archivist at Rutgers University Newark Archives and Dana Library. And she's played a really important leadership role protecting and fighting for our libraries, which is just, one of the most important fronts of struggle right here. So Angela, welcome, first of all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. And I just wanted to ask if you could talk about the ongoing austerity campaign against the libraries and the proposed $1.7 million cut. I mean, what are the consequences for library workers? The loss of our digital services during the pandemic seems really brutal. Could you just expound on some of those things?
Sure. So Rutgers University Libraries, or RUL as we call it, RUL is designated as a cost center under RCM. So the libraries do not generate income for Rutgers. And through the Barchi administration, um, our allocations had been flat, if not reduced. And so, but even a flat budget means that there's a net decrease in support over the years. And that is still in spite of increased enrollment. And so I work at Dana Library in Newark. And one of the outcomes at my branch is that we've had nearly 40% of our library faculty leave, either, basically through attrition, some retirements. And that 40% loss doesn't even include the cuts in library staff, who are the ones who ensure access and technical services. And so regarding the $1.7 million cut, due to this declared fiscal emergency, we've had this imposed on us by our university librarian. And one of the fallouts from this is that, at least for library faculty, we are increasingly being asked to think of fundraising strategies. And we're being asked to think of ways in which we can create a brand, a library brand, and somehow market our services. But since our operating budgets they've already been at a bare minimum, it means that the cuts will have to come out of library payroll and our library collections. And so that leads to, the start of this fiscal year, the library administration imposed some drastic cuts on the library collections budget. And that included some subscriptions to academic journals. And the way this problem was presented to us, it was as though the library administrators were prepared to cut subscriptions to the most esteemed and essential academic journals that we all need for our work. And at the beginning of the fall semester of this academic year, RUL library faculty, we were compelled to reach out to our colleagues who do research and teaching and let them know about these cuts and the impact on academic journal subscriptions for this academic year. And thanks to the input of our colleagues, our teaching faculty and researchers, we were able to take some important academic journal subscriptions off of the chopping block for this academic year. And then in general, just the treatment of workers in the library has not been good. The pandemic has not been good. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the libraries had to appeal so that we could close. Our university librarian was not, she was not, I guess, considering our safety and health issues. And so we had to actually, we had to make noise in order to have her actually close the libraries. And we did, I thought, a pretty good job of having to switch to all remote services, providing things electronically as much as we can. And so we find ourselves again in the same kind of controversy about workers having to, return to the building. And so we're still we're still fighting about safety and health issues in the library for workers. What's happened is that the librarians have the option to work in the buildings, but the rest of the staff who are responsible for access and technical services have been required to work in the buildings, even through the winter recess, when there's very little library use. So it hasn't been resolved, but we're fighting. And I'm done.
Angela, thank you so much for that powerful account. I think many of us knew about the $1.7 million cut, but we didn't understand that it was being taken out of salaries. Thank you for all of your important leadership. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Christine O'Connell, who is the president of the Union of Rutgers Administrators, URA-AFT. AFT New Jersey Higher Ed Vice President and member of the Board of Trustees of Middlesex AFL-CIO. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Chenjerai, for inviting me to join you tonight. I'm going to speak a little bit about the impact of the flawed formula that is RCM that drives the budgetary discretions of this university, right? And how it impacts particularly staff in a variety of ways. So the budget model presumes that each unit is fiscally responsible for its own activities, right, and accountable for its own department direct and indirect expenditures. So like David was saying earlier, it is a eat what you kill or kill what you eat model, right? But the difficulty with staff is that we work in both the responsibility controlled centers, which is the givers, right? We work in the cost centers, which are the takers, right? So we're at the whim of whomever is creating the budget at that moment, right? And then in RCM, there's no grace for departments that have been profit makers in the past or departments that make no money but are vital for a robust higher ed institution like the libraries, right? So, for example, some departments are harder hit because of the metrics that they have falsely used to drive their budget making decisions. Okay, so I'm going to say dining as a highlight. The Department of Dining has always been an income generating department, right? They always make money. They just have, and they make record amounts of money. And before RCM, they were able to take their profit and sock it away and then spend it on their own projects, whether it was creating a new dining area or what special events for students, whatever they decided themselves. But with RCM, profit is now skimmed off and sent to central, right? So, and it leaves them enough of their basic needs. The difficulty is the formula includes square footage, essentially renting space as part of the budget creating of that department, right? So in universities, some of the largest spaces are going to be the dining halls, right? So if a department is forced to pay for its utility through a facility fee, aka a tax, right? And that is based on square footage. The Department of Dining is at a deficit to begin with. It is more at a deficit when during a pandemic, we don't have students living on campus and buying meal plans. So they automatically experience a false deficit, because if we would have taken all the years of savings that we had, we could have gone, walked merrily through this current pandemic. But we can't because of RCM, right? Because of those costs that have been skimmed. Now, the charge, even though students aren't here, the charge for those spaces still exists. That formula hasn't been changed, right? They didn't cut higher level staff, management, whose full-time costs are greater, right? They cut a greater number of lower level people in order to continue paying the false tax, right? And if there was no RCM, then central administration wouldn't get their cut, but then at the same time, we wouldn't have lost approximately 1,000 people in just one department alone, right? We also, we touched briefly on SAS, right? SAS is the Schools of Arts and Sciences is the largest college here at Rutgers University. Their factors in creating the budget is what they used as rationale to eliminate centers, eliminate staff, and eliminate programs ultimately, right? So it's less about serving students and giving opportunities for faculty to research and study. It's less about giving our students opportunities to grow and learn. It is about crafting more positions within management, right? Within the higher management. So currently, as they laid off 10 people, 12 people who make about $50,000 each, they have promoted and created, 3 new senior vice president positions and have posted 2 new vice provost positions. So it really is a matter of choice, right? Who are we choosing to serve the students or to create more managers to manage less people? Because when you continue to lay people off, there's just less people around. Our previous speaker spoke about libraries, right? Libraries is an institution, is something that is foundational to any research university, right? Recently, we lost over 10 employees in libraries. It's not because there's less need, right? There is the choices that are made are not people-centric, right? And that's what it really comes down to. And again, we have to pay for space through this RCM model. So the second largest space in a university is traditionally a library. So in paying for square footage, we once again choose to fund a false formula instead of the people who actually serve the communities. And finally, I'm just gonna, we have a special space here at Rutgers University, and it's called Rutgers Gardens. I don't know how many of you have ever been. It's a beautiful little oasis in a very urban community. It's essentially an agricultural research center, right? And it allows faculty and students and grad students who are studying agriculture to begin active, innovative research, right? So we've had people that have worked there since 1973 that were laid off. I was a child. I'm not going to say how old, but I was a child, right? So, we're taking long-time employees that don't make a ton of money, that have devoted their lives to this institution, that are cruelly discarded, disposed because of an arbitrary, fundamentally flawed formula that the university continues to use to focus on the things that they choose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I just think that's such a clear example of how, these false deficits and all of these things that are encoded into this budget really don't actually center people, don't center what we claim we value most. So I really appreciate you helping us to see how that works. And one other thing I want to say about RCM is that it's coming into a context where we already have some pre-existing structural inequalities between our campuses. So Camden's campus, Newark's campus, and New Brunswick, these campuses aren't necessarily treated or valued the same way. So to talk more about this, I wanted to bring on Jim Brown. And Jim Brown is an associate professor of English, director of the Digital Studies Center at Rutgers Camden. He's also president of the Camden chapter of Rutgers AAUP-AFT. Welcome, Jim. And could you just talk about how RCM sort of affects or exacerbates those pre-existing structural inequalities between campuses?
I can, and thank you for having me here to talk tonight. Thanks to everybody who's spoken already. So, just to give people some quick context, Camden is a small campus. We're roughly half the size of Newark, much, much smaller than New Brunswick. And prior to the pandemic, Camden was already feeling the RCM squeeze. We were being told we were $30 million in debt as a campus. One small example of the kinds of things that were happening pre-pandemic, we had learned right before the pandemic hit that the Camden campus would not be having a Rutgers Day celebration, which is the sort of big public-facing event where the university gets to interact with the citizens of New Jersey to kind of show off the things that they do. And that was because of money. You know, we were told we didn't have the money to do that. The other two campuses get Rutgers Day, Camden doesn't get it. That seems very, very small right now, but it was an indication of things to come. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about how the linking of enrollments to revenue has affected Camden, because not all students count the same, really, is what I want to sort of talk about a little bit. About 4 years ago, Camden instituted a program called Bridging the Gap that some of you might have heard of. It was a big push to increase our four-year student population. We have a lot of transfer students, and they wanted to sort of bring a lot of students to campus for 4 years. And in order to do that, they set up a system where if your household made under $60,000, you could essentially come to Rutgers for free. And then it sort of moves up from there. And that essentially doubled enrollment at the Camden campus very, very quickly. Now, that's exactly what it was designed to do. And if you look at the sort of way that that program was marketed and the way that they talked to faculty about it, it wasn't just to increase enrollments, but it was to increase enrollments among a particular population, that is first generation college students, that is people who had the grades to get into Rutgers but not the money, because, you know, that's the way the system was set up. Now, when a Bridging the Gap student arrives on campus, they aren't bringing the same dollars to the campus, and RCM knows that, and management knows that, and so they count those students differently. So essentially, we increased our enrollments, which means, you know, more infrastructure, more services, more classes, more everything, but the enrollment dollars did not come with those students. And so we have been essentially punished for that program over the last 4 years. So I want to point to that, and another couple of things about how not all students are counted the same. Rutgers Camden has, relatively speaking, very few international students and very few out-of-state students, which means, again, fewer tuition dollars coming to the Camden campus. But we have, and as I mentioned previously, more than half of our students are first generation, as compared to the numbers I saw last time were about a third at Newark and about a third at New Brunswick were first generation. And with that fewer number of international and out-of-state students, our sort of effective number of students is just lower, if you really count the way that students are counted. What all of this ends up meaning is about half of every dollar that comes to Camden, the Rutgers Camden campus, goes to Central. 50 cents on the dollar is paid in overhead to Central. It's something more like 30, 35 cents at the other two campuses. So you have a smaller campus being asked to take on a larger burden, being asked to serve a particular set of populations. I mean, if you think about it, it's New Jersey residents who are first generation students. That's our typical student. So we are that institution at Rutgers. And I should say, we're proud to be that institution at Rutgers. We are very happy to fulfill that role, but we are currently getting really, really squeezed by an RCM system that is asking us, or that is continually telling us, we are $30 million in debt and we can't do X, Y, and Z right now. If I want to make a purchase, I direct a research center. If I want to make a purchase that is greater than $500, it has to go all the way up to Mike Gower and it has to be approved. My dean has to go to Mike Gower and say, we want to spend $750. That's what's happening in Camden right now. So I can talk more in the Q&A about the specifics of that, but I want to stop here and just say, you know, this system is putting the squeeze on every campus and every student and every faculty member and every staff member. And but I do want to point out that Camden is feeling the squeeze in a kind of more intense way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for your leadership. It's such a powerful account of the structural inequalities between campuses and how in turn that relates to racial and class inequalities within our public university. So I'd like to introduce our two final speakers, Helen Scott and Felicia Kornbluh, who we're very lucky to have tonight visiting us from the University of Vermont. Helen Scott is a professor of English at UVM, department representative for United Academics, AFT, AUVP, Vermont AFL-CIO, vice president for AFT, and a member of UVM United Against the Cuts. And I'll introduce Dr. Kornbluh as well. Dr. Felicia Kornbluh is a professor of history, former president of United Academics, the Union of the University of Vermont faculty, AFT, AAUP, and an activist with UVM United Against the Cuts. Helen, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm stunned by hearing your stories, and it's so important to hear what your struggles are and to see the similarities that we're facing despite the immense differences between our institutions. So at the University of Vermont last fall, non-teaching staff, part-time teachers and lecturers were hit with pay cuts and layoffs. Course releases and stipends were taken away from tenure track faculty whose workloads increased. And the only campus daycare center was closed. And so a coalition of faculty and students and staff came together to form UVM United Against the Cuts in order to protest these measures. And then in December, after many months of struggle and facing the pandemic, obviously, management dropped a bomb. The Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences announced plans to terminate 27 majors, minors, and programs, consolidate languages and the arts, and close the departments of classics, geology, and religion. And then also right before the winter holidays, 3 senior lecturers were told they would no longer have jobs next fall. So there's nothing strategic or rational about these cuts. It's very much a short-term slash and burn attempt to, quote, balance the budget in the college. And the dean was told he had to find a way to save money no matter the damage. And when confronted by faculty arguing that these cuts would irreparably harm the long-term health of the university, the dean admitted that this was a roll of the dice. But the rationale is a so-called budget deficit of around $8 million. Now, the College of Arts and Sciences is repeatedly told that it's not sustainable, that its costs are too high, and that retrenchment is the only solution. But none of this is true. So our budget is called the incentive-based budget, or IBB model. It was introduced at UVM in 2015, despite a vote of no confidence from the Faculty Senate. Like RCM, under IBB, colleges and departments are treated as separate entities, and they're responsible for balancing their own budgets, competing for resources. We're not seen as integral parts of an organic whole. It's very parallel. The budget supposedly works according to neutral and immutable metrics, but in fact, it's centrally controlled by the top administration who decide how money is allocated. So our tuition dollars are put into a subvention fund and from there distributed across the university. So in the last 4 years, the College of Arts and Sciences contributed 44% of total tuition dollars, 88 million, which is by far the lion's share. There are 7 colleges. One college contributed 44%, but the college only received $54 million back, and the rest was siphoned off to prioritize other priorities, including 23 million in the salaries, benefits, and bonuses of the 131 top earning executives. And meanwhile, despite being the cash cow, the College of Arts and Sciences was systematically starved and then punished for not thriving. As our campaign literature puts it, this is not a budget crisis, but a crisis of priorities. Far from being in a state of financial exigency, the university as a whole is remarkably well off. The 2020 year-end financial report showed a net increase of 24 million. $45 million in federal CARES funds have more than covered the costs of COVID-19, with almost 11 million more on its way. There is an untapped $34 million rainy day fund and an endowment of more than half a billion. And yet classics, geology, and religion are being shuttered in the name of an $8 million shortfall. And 3 lecturers with combined salaries of around $170,000 are fired by a dean who makes himself more than $270,000. And the head basketball coach gets a bonus of $235,000. And the problem is that those in control are not prioritizing education or equity. They see the university as a corporation competing for student dollars. They're oriented on the business world, the job market, and improving their ratings and image. That's why they're following the current trend for technical training, expensive and ineffective consultant contracts, and vanity projects, such as our soon-to-come $95 million sports arena. And of course, they prioritize and protect their own excessive compensation. UVM United Against Cuts instead looks at education as a public good. We want our university to provide a quality liberal arts education. We want to contribute to Vermont, as was its land grant purpose. We want to nurture our students' critical thinking and understanding of the world. We know the university's wealth could be used to nurture and enhance academic programs, ensure livable wages for all who work on campus, increase anti-racist and anti-sexist initiatives, so much more. But management has made it clear that they won't be moved by moral suasion or superior logic. So we need to build solidarity between students, faculty, staff, and the community, and we need to increase our organizational power so that we are ready for what proves to be an epic battle. And I know that you're all facing the same epic battle here, and we're going to stand in solidarity with you too.
Thanks, Professor Scott. I think we at the University of Vermont may be kind of like the ghosts of Christmas future for Rutgers. I hope not. I hope that this is a fate that that you all can avoid. I'm going to emphasize 2 points in just extending Professor Scott's analysis and overview. And the first is the way that the promise of what on your campus is called RCM and what on our campus is called IBB, the promises of decentralization and of greater authority at the level of the department, or at least the level of the school. And that is an absolute lie. In fact, what this winds up producing is greater central administrative interference in priorities at the college level and even at the departmental level. And in fact, we have top central administrators who are micromanaging what should be academic priorities more than ever. And the second thing is the way it makes a mockery of the promise of diversity and all of the rhetoric that is circulating at a liberal university like ours, and I think also at yours, about racial diversity and even what they sometimes call equity. My work is at the intersections of history and gender, sexuality, and women's studies, and I also teach and work some in Jewish studies. And I have to tell you, all of those programs and departments are suffering. They've been absolutely shorn to the bone by this IBB budgeting system, by these created crises. So the first example is Jewish studies, which is the most egregious. The Jewish studies at the program at the University of Vermont has essentially ceased to exist. It was a small, struggling program to start with. The one program coordinator had her stipend removed. The program was folded back into the religion department, and now the religion department as a whole has been slated for elimination. I designed a course in American Jewish history, something that we might think is useful at a time of rising and historically high anti-Semitism in the United States. I might just never be able to teach that course again. And I was the only one who ever taught that course in the history of my university. In gender, sexuality, and women's studies, we've been surviving for a long time, mostly on the goodwill of our faculty members, not as a result of any institutional investments that we get from the central administration. But it's just become unsustainable. We've had faculty members who taught in the program or who had partial lines in the program. When they've gotten better jobs elsewhere or when they've retired, they simply haven't been replaced. So the program whittles down. The coordinator has seen their support removed successively over time. And we're reaching a point when people take sabbaticals, they don't replace our teaching. And we're reaching a point where it simply isn't possible for us to put on our curriculum anymore and to train students, at the introductory and more advanced levels. And then in the history department, this is where you really see the interference of the central administration. The history department is a successful department by any measure. They're claiming now that the only programs and departments that are imperiled are the ones that have low enrollment. The history department doesn't have low enrollment at all. It has plenty of majors and plenty of minors. And we do plenty of research. We're extremely research productive, and we're great teachers. And yet the history department is facing the loss of a senior lecturer who has 12 years of service with the university, who teaches oversubscribed courses. As it happens, he also is an excellent researcher. He's somebody who's published or edited 4 monographs, which is not even part of his job description. He makes what in the terms of the central administration is a token amount of money. And yet he's been told that his contract will not be removed as of this summer. And in a final irony, he was the one person who is teaching a class this semester on pandemics and society, which was going to be a required course in our new interdisciplinary program in health and society. I can't imagine why anybody would want to study that at this particular moment. So I just want to conclude by underlining that the kind of liberal bloviations of our university about diversity are occurring simultaneous with these devastating cuts and with this deeply harmful budgeting system. And I think it goes right back to what I think Chenjerai said at the beginning about how, or maybe it was David Hughes, about how there's all this talk, but a budget is where we really see the walk. And what we see at the University of Vermont is that in the state of Bernie Sanders, and in a state that prides itself on its brand of being liberal and diverse, its walk is pretty bad. Thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to thank all of our speakers. We're going to start opening it up. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. And we will also be putting in a link to Freedom School on YouTube in the chat. Please subscribe. That way you can stream our events live. And also we use essentially our Rutgers YouTube as an archive of all of the events that we've had. So if you're also interested in particular parts of our union activism, you can all find that history in Freedom School. So we're now going to open it up, really not just for question and answer, but really for a kind of collective discussion about RCM and the budget. Our speakers laid out really powerful evidence of all the different ways that this budgeting system is affecting the university and its 30,000 workers, 50,000 undergraduates, and 20,000 graduate students. So our first comment and question is coming from Ryan Novoleski, who is the co-president of Health Professionals Allied Employees Local 5094, representing 2,500 professionals at Rutgers Rowan University, University Hospital in Newark, very importantly, which is primarily units that were formerly part of the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. So Ryan is going to talk to us about how HPAE, which is one of our most important partners, how it's being affected by RCM and this kind of orchestrated austerity. Ryan?
Sure. So, you know, the name of our local is Health Professionals and Allied Employees, but we have a variety of staff doing all sorts of things around the university. So one of the big groups we represent is OIT. This has affected OIT in a number of ways because now suddenly OIT is required to charge for services that they provide to departments, which I'm sure you and departments know that you're getting bills from OIT for various things. The problem with that is a department that doesn't have a solid revenue stream suddenly has to pay for all these extra things from all these other departments because of RCM. And OIT may be having a budget crunch at the same time, which is sort of counterintuitive. But if departments can't actually afford to pay OIT for services, they have a smaller base of people that they're trying to collect money from. OIT, for people who don't know, the Office of Information Technology. So after the UMDNJ and Rutgers merger, we ended up sort of split between non-aligned and HPAE workers over there. So that's one example. We even counterintuitively have to pay a different part of OIT in our own department, even though we're part of OIT, which has administrative overhead and things like that. And you know, any of these departments who can't afford to pay for these services have to do it themselves at the same time when they're having funding problems and can't hire additional staff. So they're just dumping an increased workload on individual departments. We're also running into a problem with tuition reimbursement. Not all of our staff can actually make use of tuition remission because Rutgers doesn't offer the courses, or a healthcare schedule doesn't work for a physical in-person class or something like that, and online classes are exempted from tuition remission. So now employees who are already getting the squeeze are having to pay for these tuition out of their own pocket. So that's another way that we're just sort of shifting the costs onto employees. They already mentioned departments like the libraries or other areas that have large physical plants that don't have a real income stream. Public health related departments. So Rutgers has quite a role in providing for public health for the community through mental health services, through our nurses that work in the foster care system. None of these things are particularly profitable. Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement rates are not sufficient generally to pay for the actual costs of care. And so it has a theoretical negative impact on our public health mission. It also, Donna mentioned University Hospital. Rutgers has a relationship with University Hospital, at least the behavioral health sciences portion of Rutgers up in Newark. We're seeing, because of financial considerations, thoughts of merging the medical schools and additionally increasing a relationship with RWJ Barnabas, which is diverting people who are working in the medical school and training at University Hospital, diverting those people to the suburbs and reducing care for places like University Hospital because of financial interests. So it's a lot of different ways that we're seeing that personally. I believe that's everything I was going to say. So all over the place.
Thank you so much for that, Ryan. I did want to stress the issue of University Hospital. When the merger occurred with UMD&J and Rutgers New Brunswick, this very important public hospital was essentially severed. And it's an ongoing question about the funding and support for University Hospital, which is one of the most important public hospitals in the region. And Ryan, if I understand correctly, isn't it the only public hospital in New Jersey?
It is. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was something I forgot to say. We're the last remaining one. And actually, particularly during the COVID response, we have been a leader in the area for coordinating care. We were made responsible for the field hospital that was set up in, I believe it was the Meadowlands Expo Center, stuff like that. Thankfully, the state has been funding them appropriately and has realized the role. But yes, there are no other public hospitals in New Jersey anymore. And we're probably at risk after this.
I just want to jump in and say, first of all, thank you, Ryan, for that. And, I'm just thinking about the thread that's gone through all these talks. David started us off well talking about how a budget, which appears to be this neutral sort of fact-based thing, actually winds up being a device that it can achieve so many other nefarious political ends. And I think that we're really seeing examples of that, right? Ideas about meritocracy out the window, using, earning what you eat or eat what you kill or whatever kind of metaphors we want to think about. And I just, just thinking how that runs through everything that everyone said. I hope everyone doesn't ever, none of us can, we can feel empowered to push back against these when people try to wield budgets against us and RCM against us. Coming into the stack, we had a question that I just wanted to lift up. I don't know if Deborah Hill is with us and wants to come on screen to ask your question, maybe in the stack. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it.
Either way, I'm just asking, under Title VI, right? It would seem that, the impact is disproportionately discriminatory, right? To marginalized communities, both as students, so the impact of the institution to be able to deliver goods, but also to the employees there also fit into that category. So it would seem like, excuse me, the threat or the actual looming reality of a Title VI lawsuit would have really solid ground here. I mean, I may be crazy as a bed bug, but, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, but, as I read the law, it fits. That's it.
Does anyone want to address that? And, let's try to be mindful of time. The briefer each person is, the more brief each person is, the more people can speak. So anyone want to address that?
Well, I'll just say a quick thing. I'm not a lawyer, but I do play one on TV. I'm a legal historian and I work in the interdisciplinary field of legal studies. And that sounds interesting. As a political, I would say it as a political strategy more than as a technical legal strategy. But why not talk to some lawyers about it? And I don't know, is Rutgers Law School in your union? Maybe you could get some law professors to work on it.
We do. We have a number of wonderful colleagues, including Jim Pope from Rutgers Newark, who's just been an absolute pillar foundation of our union. Okay, so we have a bunch of people, I think, who are on stack. Next is David Kosembia, who put a question in the stack, and I'll just let him say that in person.
Hi, just wanted to know how faculty at other institutions could get the kind of information that you all have. And are there special obstacles for private faculty at private institutions?
I can jump in on that one, David. David, by the way, is the organizer for AAUP in the Northeast region, and is a phenomenal resource, both for us here and in Vermont and every place in between. When I walked you through the website of finance.rutgers.edu, I meant to show you how easy it is to get the most important factoids about the budget, which is all about the finances. Which is all you need to know that there's a huge surplus which the administration is hiding from us and refusing to use during the pandemic. Now, of course, if you want to know more, there's more on that website. There's also the Open Public Records Act, which we have used to track individual budget lines, but that's only for public records, as David suggests. For private universities, there's the 990 form, which all nonprofits have to file with the IRS, and that'll tell you something. There are leaks. I often find administrators are very eager to leak stuff if they have the right mechanism and connections to do that. But that's about all I can say about private places, I'm afraid, David.
Cool. All right. The next comment that I have in the stack is coming from Ed Cohen. And so, Ed, if you're there, if you'd like to come on screen and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, yeah. I talked to Jenny Breyer, who's a former graduate student at Rutgers, who's now the chair of women's studies at University of Illinois at Chicago. And she said to me that they have managed to pause RCM at UIC for COVID. And I'm wondering if we know how they did that. And if so, what strategies did they use? And is it possible for us to use some strategies like that to use COVID to our advantage rather than it being used against us?
I could start. I could start with a response. One of the interesting things that's happened is that all of our individual departments and programs have been trying to figure out what to do with the failure of the central administration to fund graduate extensions. So as you heard from Ian Gavigan, who explained so powerfully the kinds of dilemmas that graduate students are facing when they can't do the essential research that they need in order to get PhDs while also entering a job market that has been vastly reduced. So this is really an existential crisis. So in response to this, the history department, led by Paul Hannebrink, by Alistair Bellany and Jennifer Middlestadt, started thinking about, in lieu of an immediate funding extension last year, so this is in the spring of 2020, the history department decided to reduce its admissions. So for the next 2 years, admissions are being reduced to 5 students per year, which is roughly a third to a quarter of what our normal admissions is. Now, as you can imagine, as we've talked about RCM, this created a problem with RCM, because what RCM does is that it looks at the budget only from 1 year. So if you don't admit graduate student cohorts or reduce the numbers, then you would initially, if you were to apply the rules of RCM, it would mean that that would only affect the budget for that year. So they approached Peter Murch, the head of the School of Arts and Sciences. They provided a kind of alternate budget model and said, okay, can we pause RCM or kind of reform it for 5 years? So it would make it possible for those savings to be carried over a 5-year period, thereby providing monies that the history department would save that could be used for a graduate extension in history. So this is an example where we were forced to cut ourselves. And this is the violence also of austerity. You can imagine this has created conflict between different fields because of the pause on admissions and this extreme austerity, but this was done really as a kind of, emergency measure because of our real concern for our graduate students. But one of the important things about this is it does show you the arbitrary nature that all of our speakers have spoken to, that we provided an alternate budget model in which the individual department cut itself, and then we were able to win an exception from RCM. So that's, a partial answer. Do other people have thoughts on the panel?
I have a quick thought about that actually, and this is something that's come up in a couple of EEC meetings and other sort of union meetings. But that story has me thinking about the sort of bigger issue behind or above RCM, which is that faculty, staff, and students have no say in the making of a budget, as far as I can tell. So we are handed a budget, or we are asked to propose a potential budget, and then it's handed back to us with a bunch of cuts, and then it goes back and forth. But that's not really a sort of voice in the actual making of the budget. And so one of the things we have been trying to think about at Camden in the College of Arts and Sciences is amendments to the college bylaws that give faculty an actual voice in the creation of the budget. That is, it's not that the dean hands us a budget and says, sorry, like this is what the folks above me handed me and this is what you get, but that we have a collaborative across departments, college level or broader discussion about budgets, which of course works directly against what RCM is supposed to do, as David and others have noted. Like collaboration is the enemy of RCM. But there may be some ways to sort of think about the bigger issue beyond RCM, that is the top-down way that budgets are made, and to think about reinserting ourselves into the nitty gritty of making these budgets and making and creating these fictional documents in collaboration with one another. And I think bylaws might be an interesting place to look.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Can I just jump in? This is Christine. I just want to jump in real quick. Just what Jim was saying is really about shared governance, I think, in totality, right? It's looking at how we all have some expertise in what our needs are. And Central doesn't know everything, and they don't have an understanding of what all our needs are, because they're from 30,000 feet up and also have their own best interests at heart, right? So it's a flawed concept that we're working with and working within their system. So either we have to break it or we have to demand a seat at that table. I don't know which one is easier, to tell you the truth, but I know that staff frequently feel frustrated because they are intimately involved in the crafting of a budget, but have absolutely no input in said budget, right? And are essentially, inconsequential when it comes to the actual implementation of that budget. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Christine. I think these issues of shared governance are absolutely central to this and things that we need to push for. Next in the stack, I think we had Andres.
No, you know what? Could I
Okay.
make an intervention before we move on to Andreas?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, responding to Christine, Jim, and others who have spoken, another reason that we're holding the Freedom School right now is that, of course, we've all received the emails that RCM is currently under review by our new president, Jonathan Holloway. So in that sense, this isn't just a kind of theoretical discussion. It's also for us to think about how to respond to that. And Christine's point made me think about that question of, the budget, the control over the budget seen from on high and controlled from on high, that is often disconnected from the everyday functioning of all these different aspects of this enormous public institution. One of the best examples of this is that when the faculty were emailed about input on the RCM reform, we were asked to identify ourselves, and we were given 3 categories. Do you teach undergraduates? Do you teach graduate students? Or do you do research? And the idea that the people who are drafting the survey form have no idea what a professor does. And that's just one example. That's an example from the faculty who are allowed to have input. But we can imagine that kind of disconnection from the actual everyday material of the work is true for all of the people on this call and all of the people working in the university. So the kind of crafting of budgets is entirely separate from the work that's being done. So yes, we want to think about this. And I think for all of us in our different unions, our different job categories, and our different campuses, thinking about how to concretely organize to fight about governance. I think there are 2 issues that are prime here. It's governance and questions of governance, but it's also the transparency of public institutions, especially during a period in which the federal government has been providing federal stimulus for COVID-19. And looking for transparency about how these federal monies and state monies are being used. So I think this has always been an issue with us as a public university, but it's especially acute right now. So I think we had Isan, who was on the stack.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for organizing this. Like, what an incredible Freedom School, and what a timely and necessary one. I think I've showed that video of Chenjerai so many times to people to try and kind of turn on the importance of this, and it not just being like this faraway concept that we shouldn't be invested in. So thank you. And thank you to Danielle and Kat, who produced and edited and sent that baby out into the world. My question has to do with what, Donna and Ian have been discussing time and time again about grad funding. And we've seen a couple departments across campuses who have come to their own conclusion, like one way or another, on how to offer grads assistance For example, my department at the School of Criminal Justice in Newark, over the summer, we expressed a financial need. We were suffering and struggling. And our faculty and our staff came together and they pulled out of their own reserves in order to help us and to give us grants, right? And various departments like sociology at New Brunswick, they offered their grads a 1 semester extension right now. I just wanted to ask, what are the undue burdens being placed here on these departments? Like, what does this look like long term? Thank you.
I'll say a word about that. I do want to know more about what's going on in sociology in New Brunswick, Eastham. That was the first I'd heard about that. You know, we're right across one road from them in anthropology. And we considered what Donna just mentioned, history doing, which is sort of, you know, poaching our seed corn in order to keep our children alive. Not to be patronizing about it, but you do have to privilege the people in front of you rather than the people who might come to Rutgers. So it makes sense to take fewer new students in order to support the current students. But we recognize that in cultural anthropology, for example, we only take 2 students every year. So if we take 1 next year, then the 2, that's actually more like 6 who are here now taking courses, have 1 fewer colleague, right? And so it actually is that in small programs, the current grad students need new cohorts of only slightly younger or slightly junior colleagues in their seminars. So small programs can't actually do what history did. It's not in anybody's interest, which is why we need a more global solution to reach into the large pockets of the university and solve this problem, as the administration did for assistant professors. Although I don't have time to get into it now, but the financial calculus is a little bit different for tenure track faculty than for any other employees, because the assumption is that tenure track faculty will continue for a whole career. But nonetheless, they provided this effective extension for assistant professors.
So I think we have David next on stack. David Letwin. Do we have David Letwin here?
Oh, hi, Donna. Yeah, let me just, let me get my video on. There. Hello, everyone. My name is David Letwin. I'm a PTL at Rutgers Arts Online from Mason Grove School of the Arts, and I'm also on the executive board of the PTL faculty chapter at AAUP. And as I posted in chat, our treasurer, Brian Sachs, couldn't be here tonight. He's teaching, but he sent in a message that I just wanted to briefly read to everyone. As treasurer of the PTL unit, I know I may be biased in this regard, but I think it's vital for PTLs to understand RCM and to know how to confront it during our next contract negotiation. So much revolves around its regressive assumptions, which pit departments against one another and place competition for students rather than cooperation between departments at the center of their budgeting. So long as PTLs suffer under conditions of contingency at Rutgers, RCM will be used to justify cutting our numbers or raising our course caps whenever it can be gotten away with. Of course, it's students who suffer most when this happens. On behalf of the PTLFC, many thanks to Dr. Murch, Dr. Kumanyika, and everyone who planned and participated in this important event. We stand in solidarity with all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your patience as well. Just trying to stick with our stack for one more comment. We have Andres had a comment. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's more of a technical sort of comment. I mean, question about how RCM works. But I mean, I'm confused about the entire tax or rent or whatever for the square footage of buildings that's being done, at least in our case. But I'm just wondering how that relates. Like, if the what determines the amount that's being charged, and what's the rationale that's given, if any? Because it just doesn't make sense to me why they would charge rent for one's own employees. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. I just don't get it.
May I answer that from what I know a little bit? Okay, so
Thank you.
it's essentially, Andres, my understanding, and this is the part that I don't get. They create an internal formula, right? Some of it is based on fixed costs, right? So what does it cost to heat everything? What does it cost to keep the lights on? What does it cost, right? Those are legitimate costs. But since Rutgers owns many of the buildings, the square footage is kind of fluffy, right? And particularly now during COVID, when we know that the lights are off in most of the classrooms, and we know that, you know, you don't have to heat as hot, and particularly at Rutgers, it's either really, really hot or really, really cold, right? So, you know, all those costs have been reduced, right? And since most of the staff and faculty are telecommuting, we're not a drain on their electricity bill on top of everything else, because we're using our own. So I think that the formula is a lot of, hey, you know, it's BS for lack of a better word. And it certainly could be modified due to the cost being reduced, the actual cost being reduced. So when they create this formula and people's lives are in the balance of this, again, false narrative, it's kind of difficult to convince them to change it, because this is what they kind of want, right? They want the power to define what those costs are, whether they're actual or you know, imaginary. There's very little that we can do unless we do it all together.
Actually, there's something else. I didn't mention it earlier, but when I asked some of my staff and board members about the impacts of RCM, they mentioned that there were departments where employees were physically working in different spaces that belonged to different departments. But because at that point there was going to have to be chargebacks for, like, okay, your employee has a cubicle in my building, they had to do a lot of reshuffling because departments didn't think that it was worthwhile to pay rent to other departments in order to house employees, even though we're the same institution. It's just sort of absurdly balkanized, I guess.
Yeah, if I can jump in here. I mean, this is a classic story about how the budget model actually costs money. So, you know, it starts with the principle that facilities cost $1 billion a year, which is almost a quarter of the university budget. They have no source of revenue, right? Because they're not putting on classes, they're not teaching patients, they're not throwing footballs around, they're just keeping the walls and the lights on. It's important, but they don't have a source of revenue. So they're a cost center, not a responsibility center, but a cost center. And so, like Christina's saying, they have to tax all of the responsibility centers, right? So in theory, I teach in my classroom and students come in there and they need to be warmed up. And when there's not a pandemic, they leave their trash behind. Somebody needs to clean that up. There's a cost. Facilities should get the money to cover employees doing that kind of thing. But figuring it out is ridiculous, because do you count closets? Do you count corridors? Like Ryan is saying, do you count the situation where somebody crosses a hallway from, you know, from France to Britain and pays a different tax? So figuring it out creates competition and a huge transaction cost. And it's a Rube Goldberg cube kind of thing. I also want to, if I can jump back to this question that David Letwin raised about bargaining over responsibility management. We actually defeated it in a small way in the last round of the AAUP-AFT contract, because there's a line regarding the equity pay corrections that says the university commits to funding approved equity pay corrections. That was one of the last two things that they agreed to on the last night when we were about to strike. The university commits to funding. The university means the central administration. We were not going to sign a contract that did not bind the central administration, not the schools, not the departments, not even the campuses, but the central administration to pay those equity corrections. And then only in September, as soon as we started to try to implement them, this started in Camden with deans saying, we can't pay those raises because we have no money. And so the union went to the Board of Governors, and we extracted from Mark Angelson, the chair of the Board of Governors, who's the top honcho of the whole place. We extracted the commitment to honor the commitment that the central administration pays, right? And the language that we've put forward around the grad extensions now carries forward that phrase, saying that the university commits to funding approved graduate extensions for related to COVID impacts, right? Now, getting the money is a different question. And you all know this pay equity thing has become a nightmare. But the language stands in direct contravention to RCM, and it is a wedge that we can widen at the bargaining table.
Okay, thank you so much for really digging into that for everybody. One thing that's really clear to me is the fact that while RCM claims to be this thing that's somehow going to be better for the university, decentralized, et cetera, that the people who wind up paying the cost are really the most vulnerable workers in our university, including PTLs, who I just, to any PTL who's listening, I want to thank you for your work. And nothing I do in my job would be possible without the PTLs. And talking about our librarians, I mean, just all these folks we see who actually are paying the brunt of this kind of austerity. So I just wanted to make sure we lift that up and find a way to overcome whatever our differences are so that we can fight this together.
Thank you so much for that, Chenjerai. So I guess we're moving to the close of our Freedom School. Before we do that, I just wanted to ask people for final remarks, brief final remarks, to think about what are our organizing opportunities around this. So David opened up the door about talking about COVID. What we really want to think about is how we can use this review of RCM to our advantage. So we've talked about, I think the first way to figure out a solution is always to start with a problem. So tonight has been a wonderful way to lay out all the different ways that RCM is destructive. So I'd especially be interested to hear if people have organizing ideas or initiatives or things that we should know about. Feel free to post them in the chat. And I also want to especially thank our colleagues from the University of Vermont for coming and building with us and sharing what's happening at their university. And if Helen and Felicia, you can tell us what we can do in order to support your struggle at UVM and offer solidarity.
Well, Helen had to go, so I'll just say a couple of things. First, just a thought that's been brewing for me. I think it's important for us at UVM, and I would also recommend to you all to stop talking about this budgeting model as though it's economically rational, and as though what we're fighting is turning the university into a business, or making the university adhere to economic rationality. I mean, that would be problematic in itself, but that's not actually what this is, right? We're not talking, because we're not talking about a situation in which they're following the metrics of where the tuition dollars are coming from and where the taxpayers' dollars are coming from, and so on. So I think we need a different language. I think one of our organizing strategies needs to be a different way to talk about this. And I like what I'm hearing tonight in really focusing on this as being about power. This is about power. This is about higher level, very, very highly paid people who are interested in running the university the way they want to run it, and in making the rest of us beg them all the time, beg them and fight each other, for crumbs from the table. It's not about being economically rational or being some kind of Adam Smith ideal of like good economic actors, because then we seem like we're fighting that, where we somehow want to live, with our heads in the clouds and want to fight paying our bills or something like that. I mean, that's the way the debate has been going in Vermont. And that's the way our Board of Trustees and even some of our state legislators have been sort of chiding us, like, you liberal arts professors, you don't understand that we have to live in the real world. So I think that's, I mean, it's not a discrete organizing strategy, but it's kind of a meta organizing strategy about languaging and how to talk to our Board of Trustees, and in your case, your Board of Governors and our state legislators. And I think something has to shift there. And in terms of helping us, I think the biggest thing is we do have this organization which is kind of running parallel to our union called UVM United Against the Cuts. And there's a very active Facebook page, and there are a lot of events coming out. So please check us out on Facebook, UVM United Against the Cuts. Get involved through that, come to our events. We have had letter writing campaigns. Some people think they're of limited utility in the face of this kind of administration. But I think they do have to listen, especially when people on the outside of Vermont and outside of our faculty, let them know that they're paying attention. We've also been doing everything we can to generate media. I think we should work with you all to generate national media as much as we can, and get this in the Chronicle and get it in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I think we need to raise these issues to a higher level and make sure that people know that this isn't just, a Rutgers problem. It's not just a UVM problem. It's not just a University of Illinois problem, but there's something deeply systemic going on here. So thank you so much for your solidarity and collaboration and support. And we want to be there for you too.
Thank you. Thank you, Felicia. Excellent.
Final remarks from anyone else? All right, well, thank you all so much. And following directly from what Felicia said, our next Freedom School is for Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education, which is exactly the kind of faculty formation that's going to work with AAUP and AFT, but also organizing people that don't have unions. So as a kind of national framing device about how to understand the centrality of higher education to communities, to workers, to students. I think this will be the second part of our conversation, and Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education may be a way to think about how to integrate these struggles that are going on across universities, both through unions and through other groups of workers. So I especially want to thank all of our speakers tonight, my co-hosts, Chenjerai, Kumanyika, Alan, Jacob, Sherry, and all the other people that made this possible. Thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. See you.